All right. So I am Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined once again by Matthew Whalan, who is a Substacker extraordinaire, was just featured on Freddie DeBoer's subscriber writing for his Substack for Matt's work in you know exposing conditions in Alabama prisons. Really happy to have him on. I look different today because my computer stopped working about an hour before we were supposed to go live. And so at some point soon, I'm going to need to go into an Apple store. I actually think something's probably going to need to be replaced. And before that, I'm in California now. I'm probably going to have to make a surprise trip to Rosarito to get my backup computer from Rosarito, because I think this computer is going to be gone for a while. But the show must go on. So here we are with me at a weird angle. How are you doing, Matt?
Oh man, I'm doing all right. Tired.
Fair enough.
But well, I'm doing well. You look like you got a haircut too, man.
I did get a haircut. Yeah, once every
Bordering
5 years,
on
whether I need it or not, man.
that's bordering on like a best man looking haircut. You got any buddies getting married?
Not unless you've got news for me. But all right, let's set this up. What are we watching tonight?
Yeah, we're watching James Risen debate Glenn Greenwald, moderated by Jeremy Scahill, which is a pretty badass lineup right there by itself. As most listeners probably know, Glenn Greenwald and James Risen, both at different times in their career, faced a lot of government pressure not to publish their work. And James Risen actually was threatened with jail time for not revealing, I think it was 7 sources, and he didn't reveal those sources. So both guys have done great national security reporting, and they are debating. So my impression from this piece, I didn't follow the career trajectory while it was happening, but my impression at the time was that Risen had just left the New York Times and was now writing for The Intercept. And one of his first pieces was called "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" And that piece is sort of the subject of this debate. And many things interesting about it. I think I don't know. For me, I've always been interested in this because I found I thought the media narrative about Trump collaborating with Russia to steal the 2016 election was very overblown, and also pretty harmful in various ways. Like, I thought it was a major disappointment that the first reflex of this insane person, and insane in kind of a new way that we hadn't seen, their first form of criticism or resistance to him was to just be really tough and provocative towards Russia,
Mm-hmm.
and which I don't think is like, first of all, I don't really think it's accurate that Trump was like friendly to Russia during his presidency. I'm
Right.
sure, and I'm sure people will disagree with that, but I think there's
Well, I mean, I think factually he really wasn't. I mean, like he
right.
actually,
He drew
Trump
the INF treaty, like
Trump in office was much more of an anti-Russia hawk than Obama had been before, right? In fact, as hard as this is to remember now, one of the big Republican criticisms of Obama when he was in office was that he wasn't enough of a Russia hawk. So in 2012, there was this amazing moment, in the Obama Romney debate where they asked them both what the biggest threat was to the United States, and Obama said climate change, and Romney said Russia. and all the libs made fun of him for like 3 days for saying Russia. He was stuck in the Cold War. And after everything that happened in Ukraine 2 years later, with whatever, all the 2014 Ukraine stuff, it was a major Republican criticism that Obama wasn't doing more to stand up to Putin. And in fact, once Trump got into office, he sent heavier weapons to Ukraine than Obama had been willing to. Obama was worried it'd be too escalatory. As you mentioned, the missile treaty. Trump backed out of. He certainly increased tensions with Russia, not only in Ukraine but everywhere from Syria, right, which he bombed. While there were Russian troops there, albeit carefully, but still.
And at the end of the war there and didn't take it.
And to Western Europe, right? With like really pushing against the Nord Stream pipeline and all of that, right? So it's certainly like you could argue about how much of this stuff, like you could argue about the counterfactual of what Trump would have done if he were in office in 2022, but like what and whether that would have been like more or less hawkish than Biden. But you really can't deny that like when he was in office, he was at least more hawkish about Russia than Obama had been.
Yeah, but I would say too that I think it's wrong when people say it about Obama too. I mean, Obama also was fairly provocative towards Russia, in my opinion, and the sort of criticism you're laying out actually of Obama is useful because it was coming from the right at that time. And just the idea that you're going to have a Republican candidate rise to the presidency and be pro-Russia in this country is implausible. But like Obama did have, weapons at one point closer to Russia's border than they had been at any point since the Cold War. And he expanded or upgraded the nuclear arsenal. But I think
to be fair, most of that had happened earlier. I mean, I think that the
NATO expanded under Obama. Like,
what's that?
I believe NATO expanded under Obama as well.
It may have. Again, I think. I mean, I'd have to go back and check the timeline. My impression is that most of that was pre-Obama. But certainly, look, I mean, he certainly was, I mean, they were certainly sending all of these signals that, we're, we want, we know it can't happen until this like civil war, in Eastern Ukraine is resolved, but like we eventually want Ukraine to be in NATO and all of that. Like a lot of that was certainly happening, under Obama. And, it's not like they weren't sending any arms for that war, just not as much as the Republicans at the time, wanted. And yeah, so I think it's, I think it's fair to say, right, Obama was like less belligerent than you and I, than less belligerent than the Republicans wanted him to be at the time, more belligerent than you or I would have wanted him to be at the time. But, Trump was more so, right? So that's so that's like, I think goes to the sort of basic implausibility of some of this stuff, but like also, I guess to my mind, what makes this sort of interesting enough to be worth revisiting now, because like, I don't know, maybe it'll start up again now that Trump's, returning to power, but I haven't really heard a lot of Trump Russia stuff lately. Like what makes it, I think, kind of worth revisiting now, to my mind, is more just like, look, the election 2 weeks ago was really like a really striking sign about just the abject failure of this entire decade-long project of liberal anti-Trumpism, right? That like, I mean, 2015 to present, right? Coming down the escalator in 2015 through the first term, through this election, like, this is, they've been basically pursuing one version or another of the same strategy, right? This whole time, right? Which is to, position Trump as being outside of the American mainstream. And I think I think that the Russia stuff is part of that. The Liz Cheney stuff is part of that. Like the sort of focus on like the legal angle, and calling him a convicted felon and all that stuff is definitely part of it, right? And so I think Glenn Greenwald has been wrong about Trump in that, like, I think Trump is much worse than Glenn thinks he is, right? But like, I think that Russiagate, besides the fact that like I think a lot of it was just kind of bullshit on the facts, right? Like a lot of it, I think if you, I think a lot of people convinced themselves that there was a lot more there than like I think a sober assessment would have told you there was at the time. But that's like, yeah, sure, there's some like extremely low effort Facebook ads and stuff, but like there's just not that much there. But like beyond that factual critique, though, it's like, look, clearly this whole decade-long strategy that the libs have used against Trump didn't work. I mean, it was Trump has, in fact, the entire decade that they've been running this strategy, Trump's support has actually increased, right? Like he lost the 2020 election, but like way more people voted for him than did in 2016. And in 2024, granted, there were fewer voters on both sides than there were in 2016. But I mean, for the first time, he won the popular vote. In fact, he was the first Republican who wasn't in office at the time of the election, right? Like, who won the popular vote since George H.W. Bush in 1988, right?
Yeah. This is my lifetime.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the only one, like the last Republican who won the popular vote before Trump, of course, was George W. Bush in 2004, but he was running as the incumbent, right? The last non-incumbent president to win the popular vote as a Republican was 1988, right? So it's
running also against the human equivalent of a plain rice cake in John Kerry.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think John Kerry was like such a bad candidate, you almost shouldn't count that one.
Right.
But Bush Dukakis in 88, first time, and granted he was the incumbent vice president, but first time a Republican who wasn't the incumbent president, was won the popular vote. So yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable accomplishment. And, and again, I mean, the fact that like so much of the liberal anti-Trump narrative has not unjustifiably been about Trump being a racist. He has said some crazily racist things, but it's like, look, if we're just calling balls and strikes about what worked and what didn't work here, Donald Trump made huge gains among like almost every non-white group in the 2024 election. In fact, if you look at the division, right, Latino men, Latino women, black men, black women, right, the single group that he did best in, right, that he made the biggest gains in out of the four was Latino men, who's actually arguably the group he's been most racist to, right? So like it just seems like the strategy for countering Trump that's been going on for the last decade is just not is just not an effective one. And and if you think Trump is really bad, and it's really bad that he's going to be president again, and etc. Right? Like then I think you need to take a look at that, which is again, to my mind, why I thought this would be an interesting. I mean, you were the one who suggested the debate, but I mean that's like part of the reason I said yes, like that I thought this would be like an interesting time to revisit this.
Yeah, and also because I think the anti-Russia narrative, or if you think it's a pro-Russia narrative, whatever, like it cuts ways. Like I also know people who voted for Trump, and this narrative has resonated so profoundly with so many people that right-wingers are just like, oh, he'll probably be able to get Putin to end the war.
Yeah.
They don't even disagree at this point. They just think it's a good thing. But I just true, like, and also I will say, like, and I know Glenn Greenwald has said some crazy shit in the past, but I think does really good reporting generally. And or I don't know, I haven't followed his work as much
No,
lately.
I mean, look, I think he's done, like, look, I'm not going to go into a whole
Wilsonville,
Glenn Greenwald thing here, but I mean, I think that, I think that, I think his career has involved some, I think he has done really good reporting at certain points. I think that there are some principles he's been very consistent about over the years that are really good. I also think that he's talked himself into some stuff over the course of the last several years that doesn't make any sense to me,
of
right?
course,
So I mean, I've
yeah,
definitely got a critique there, that in terms of how he sees American political realignment, and and again, I mean, just who counts as the lesser evil and all that stuff. I mean, I do have some very deep disagreements with him at this point, which I mean I've talked about with him on the show, but he's a serious person. He's done good work. I don't disagree with any of that. But it is time. I think
yeah.
let's all I'll probably yeah, I can do the Sam Cedar thing. Stop, right?
Yeah,
The
totally.
clip. But
Yeah,
yes, since I am on my phone and I cannot control it, I have ceded power to Matthew. So if we could start watching.
yeah, absolutely. Alright.
View from the offices of The Intercept in New York City, and this is a special video edition of Intercepted.
I was kind of stunned by how much information is already available to show that pretty conclusively that the Russians were behind the intervention in the 2016 election.
It's a long line now of stories about Trump and Russia that major media outlets have trumpeted in a very flamboyant way, only for those stories to completely fall apart upon minimal scrutiny, always going in the same direction of trying to prove that Trump really did collude with the Russians in a criminal way and that Russia is essentially taking over the United States.
James Risen and Glenn Greenwald have both won Pulitzer Prizes. Both of them have found themselves in the crosshairs of the national security state because of their reporting. And they both write for The Intercept. Glenn Greenwald is one of the most prominent skeptics of the official story involving Trump and Russia. He regularly blasts U.S. intelligence agencies, the Democratic Party, and large, powerful media organizations for how they've reported on this story. James Risen, under threat of imprisonment, battled both the Bush and Obama administrations for his refusal to name sources in some of the most sensitive national security reporting of the past 17 years. James Risen recently published a story detailing the NSA and CIA's secret communications channel with Russia. And his first column for The Intercept has the title, "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" Both men are going to hash this out as they go head to head in this special. And I'm joined right now by my two colleagues. Jim Risen is the senior national security correspondent for The Intercept, and Glenn Greenwald is my fellow co-founder of The Intercept. He's joining us from Rio de Janeiro. Welcome to you both. Jim, let's begin with you. You wrote a piece that was very provocative, has caused a lot of debate, including debate within The Intercept itself. The title of that piece was, "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" Lay out your case.
Well, it's interesting. I hadn't really written very much about the whole Trump-Russia case before. I think I was pretty agnostic about it to begin with. But I realized that there'd been so many incremental stories about it that the narrative and the case had really been lost to most people. And to me, I didn't really understand, just as a reader, how to follow these stories because they were coming out in such a kind of a chaotic, incremental way. And so I kind of dove into the available evidence. And what struck me, first of all, was the gravity of and significance of what it means potentially, because at heart, this is a case about whether or not the president of the United States is a traitor. That obviously hasn't been proven yet, but that's what this case is about. And if you read the letter that Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, wrote, signing, giving the mandate to Robert Mueller to investigate this, it reads a lot like the definition of treason. It's not the same, but it's similar enough that I think you could draw parallels.
Glenn Greenwald, let's bring you in here for a response. You have been confronted on Twitter and other social media platforms in the aftermath of Jim Risen's article with the provocative title of "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" And people were sort of saying, "Well, doesn't Glenn Greenwald read his own publication? Are you saying that Jim Risen is a liar?" Your response, Glenn, to Jim and the theory and ideas that he just laid out.
So I do want to preface everything I'm about to say in light of the internet's very charming propensity to characterize every disagreement as some kind of very personalized war, by observing that Jim Risen has long been and still is one of my heroes in journalism. His 2005 Pulitzer Prize story on the NSA is essentially what I spent the first year of my career in journalism working on. I think he was incredibly courageous the way he stood up to the Bush and then Obama administration's attempts to threaten him with prison if he didn't reveal his sources. I also regard him as a personal friend who was extremely supportive when I was doing the Snowden reporting, and I think I tried to be supportive to him during that ordeal. And he's a colleague of mine who, if you remember, Jeremy, he was pretty much at the very top of our list when we created The Intercept of people who we wanted to steal from other media organizations. And it took a few years for us to accomplish it, but I'm incredibly thrilled that he's at The Intercept. And obviously, Jim Risen didn't leave the New York Times to come to The Intercept to only write things that either Jeremy or I like and approve of. He came to have the thing that we created The Intercept to give all of our journalists, which is full journalistic autonomy and independence. And so obviously, not only is he free to write things that we disagree with, I'm really happy when he does, because I think that media outlets are much more vibrant when they accommodate really intense conflicts of perspective and disagreements. If we wanted to be MSNBC and only allow this kind of prevailing orthodoxy, we wouldn't have needed to create the Intercept. So having said all that, I do have a lot of disagreements with Jim on his views of the Trump-Russia story generally, and some really deep-seated objections to this article in particular, which I just want to outline briefly. So the one that I find the most objectionable is the way in which the entire article was framed, beginning with the headline, which suggested that Donald Trump might be a traitor. Jim, in his description of his article, began by acknowledging that he's not saying Trump is a traitor, because we don't know if Trump did the things he's accused of doing in terms of collusion. But Jim in the article did say that, and he said again now, that if Trump did in fact collude with the Russians, then it very well may mean that he's a traitor, which is another way of saying that someone is guilty of treason. And the sentence that I found most objectionable in the article itself was when Jim wrote, quote, "If a presidential candidate or his lieutenants secretly work with a foreign government that is a longtime adversary of the United States to manipulate and then win a presidential election, that is almost a textbook definition of treason." That is not just wrong, but dangerously wrong, that statement and that idea, that it's almost a textbook definition of treason. It's completely not a textbook definition of treason. And it's extremely important to be careful about what treason does and doesn't mean. And there was a fantastic article just from 2 days ago by Stephen Vladeck, who's a professor of law at the University of Texas, who on NBC's website wrote a really great article about why it's so dangerous to throw the word treason around recklessly in cases where it clearly doesn't apply. And he meant it in two senses. One, Trump had just said that maybe the Democrats were traitors for not standing and clapping for all of the great things that are happening to the United States. And then the other one is that Trump might be a traitor for colluding with the Russians. And what Professor Vladeck said, and he's a really ardent opponent of Trump, is he examined the history of treason in the United States. And he said, quote, "The mere existence of this question of whether Trump is a traitor underscores the need for a long overdue moratorium on the blithe characterization of things as treason, and for all of us to be far more careful when using that term to describe conduct that we believe is some combination of reprehensible, criminal, and perhaps even impeachable." As Jim acknowledges in the article, the Constitution defines treason. It's not a vague crime. It's one of the most specific crimes. And the Constitution went out of its way to define what treason is. It doesn't define what murder is, it doesn't define rape or pedophilia, but it does define treason. And it says treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And what Professor Vladeck said is that, contrary to Jim's suggestion in the article, that, well, it's kind of a vague term, so we don't really know if collusion would fit into it. It's actually not vague at all. And he cited a federal appeals court in 1986 who explained, quote, the reason for the restrictive definition of treason is apparent from the historical backdrop of the treason clause. The framers of the Constitution were reluctant to facilitate such prosecutions because they were well aware of abuses and they themselves were traitors in the eyes of England. As a result, treason is, in some respects, the most specific crime in our legal system, and certainly among the hardest to prove. And then he went on to apply it to this question of whether Trump could be a traitor if he colluded with Russia. And what Vladeck says is, quote, because of this history, a lot of things that might seem or feel like treason to casual observers do not, in fact, come close. In this context, enemies, for example, must be countries against which Congress has formally declared war or otherwise authorized the use of force. So contemporary Russia is out, whatever role it might have played in the 2016 election, even during the height of the Cold War. Vladeck writes, when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried, convicted, and executed for conveying nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, the charge against them was espionage, not treason. And that's because we weren't at war with the Soviet Union. And so he concludes, by those metrics, it should be obvious why it is not treason to either refuse to applaud the president or to collude with Russia to influence the outcome of a presidential election. To be sure, the latter one is worse, but treason is a crime indicating the clear support of our enemies during wartime, period.
Yeah,
and I found this framing, so I found the framing so dangerous because, for two reasons. One is, there is this attempt to suggest that Russia is our enemy with whom we're at war. And the amazing thing about that is that President Obama spent 8 years rejecting that view. During the time of the 2016 election in 2015 and 2016, when Trump was supposedly doing all these things, President Obama, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States, was saying, Russia is not our enemy. In fact, we want to partner with them in Syria, against terrorism, and elsewhere. In 2012, Mitt Romney said Russia was our enemy, and the Democrats put out a video mocking that, saying that was true in the Cold War, but in the 21st century, Russia is our partner in a whole bunch of different and important areas. So
can I ask you
never
something
get
there?
anywhere near treason. Yeah, let me just make one last point about this, Jim, because this is the other part that I think is so important. There's an irony to this, which is that when I first started writing about politics in 2005 and 2006, one of the main reasons that I stopped practicing law and started writing about politics is because I was so disturbed about the political climate in the United States. And one of the things I was most concerned about was that at the time, journalists who were revealing secrets about the war on terror were routinely being accused of being traitors, and even prosecution was commonly advocated for them. That was true of Jim and Eric Lichtbau's story exposing surveillance programs, the New York Times story exposing SWIFT, Dana Priest's story exposing black sites. And the argument at the time was, these journalists are giving aid and comfort to our enemies, Al-Qaeda, by showing them how we're tracking their finances, how we're spying on their calls, how we're detaining them. And I found that argument so revolting and repellent for the reasons I just said. The irony, though, is in that case, they actually had a better argument for these reporters having committed treason because we really were at war with Al-Qaeda. There really was a congressional declaration authorizing the use of force, unlike in the case of Russia, where we're not at war with Russia. President Obama called them our partner. And so I think to even insinuate that this is a case of treason is extremely dangerous and unwise.
All right, go ahead. Let's get
points
Jim.
to make, but go
Yeah,
ahead,
can
Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
This, what you've just expressed leads me back to what I have come to think about the way you write about the Trump and Russia story. I don't know if there was a New York Magazine story about you, and reading a lot of your writings, many times what you do is you criticize the political or journalistic points of view of either the writer or a politician who's talking about Trump and Russia fairly and often validly, but you don't deal with the underlying issue of the substance of the Trump and Russia case. For instance, just now, you made a valid criticism of the use of the word treason, but you didn't deal with the underlying issue of, do you believe that the Russians intervened in the 2016 election? In one of your most recent stories, you talk about this Dutch politician who's accused of lying about Putin, or who admitted he lied about Putin. But buried in that story, you say there's convincing evidence of Russian meddling, and you link to a story about the Internet Research Agency. But it's just like one passing phrase in a sentence.
That was the organization at the center
and then
of these indictments.
A few days later, they were indicted by Mueller. And so I wonder whether the way in which you write about these issues masks an acceptance of the substance of the case that you don't want to talk about.
Okay, so let me explain to you first why I began with the point about whether or not Donald Trump is a traitor is a fair question. It's because the headline on your story was this: is Donald Trump a traitor? Question mark. You then spent the first passage of your article saying that you thought that if this case could be proven, this is a textbook definition of treason.
And I still believe
you
that.
Then, hold on, Jim. You then went on MSNBC.
Pulitzer Prize winner James Risen writes in The Intercept, pointing out a stark truth about the man currently occupying the Oval Office.
You cracked the code for how to be an Intercept writer and get on MSNBC, which is to write an article entitled, "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" And the graphic on the screen underneath your picture was, did Donald Trump commit treason? So the reason I began my discussion of your article with this question of whether it's fair to raise the question of treason isn't because I'm trying to avoid the primary points raised by your piece. The reason I began with that is because you began with that.
Okay. Well, let me respond to let me first respond to your point about treason, which I think it is a valid question. It's a question. I didn't give an answer. I said that it's a question whether he's a traitor. I didn't say, yes, he is a traitor. I said, if you look at the issues of if you are a presidential candidate, you collaborate with a foreign government, an adversary, granted it's not an enemy of the United States, and under the legal definition of treason, that may be one reason why it will never be considered treason, as you pointed out. But the idea that if you're a presidential candidate and you get elected by colluding with an adversary of the United States, I think most Americans would think, in the common usage of that term, that would be treason. Now, I'm not saying that Donald Trump is a traitor.
But there is no definition of treason or traitor besides the legal definition.
Yeah, well, I think you're wrong about that.
I think it's a really dangerous standard.
No, I think you're wrong about. I think there's a common usage and a legal usage.
I think it's a really dangerous standard.
I said in my piece, if you recall,
to say that okay, well, maybe treason and being a traitor doesn't apply in the legal sense, but a lot of Americans think that it would apply in a colloquial sense. You know what? I can guarantee you, and I'm sure there's polling to support this, in fact, that in 2006 and in 2007, a lot of Americans believed that the New York Times was guilty of treason. A lot of people wanted to put me in jail. Exposing secrets that were designed to help Al-Qaeda learn about the U.S. And so I think it's incredibly dangerous, especially for a journalist who writes about classified programs, to say, hey, when we're talking about treason and being a traitor, let's not use this careful constitutional definition. Let's just be colloquial about it and take a poll and figure out whether or not people kind of like the behavior. And if they don't like it, let's just maybe suggest someone's. That's exactly why I think it's so dangerous. And
we can disagree on that point, but I do want to know whether or not you believe now, given the level of evidence, that there is a strong preponderance of evidence that the Russians intervened in the 2016 election.
Okay, so I think that in order to answer both of these questions, the question of whether Trump did actually collude, which I realize is not yet the subject of your story or reporting that's coming soon, as well as the question of whether or not the Russians intervene in the election, we need to be very specific about what it is that we're asking. So, for example, when we talk about collusion, and I want to address it this way on purpose, because another thing that you said in the story was, even if he's not guilty of treason, if the collusion charges are true, think about what it means. It means that he's an agent of a foreign power.
Glenn, let's just, before you do that, let's hear Jim on MSNBC. You referenced it, so let's go to that clip of Jim.
If collusion is proven, then I think almost by definition he's a traitor. And I think everyone is afraid of the consequences of using that word because it's so fraught. But that is essentially what it is. If you collude with an adversary of the United States to take over the government of the United States, you're a traitor.
Right. So I think anyone who just reads the Constitution would know that that's not the case. But on the question of collusion, so let's ask what it is.
Wait a second. I asked you whether you believe that the Russians intervened in the election.
Jem, you can't keep interrupting me
No,
and then accusing me of
fine.
not answering. I can only answer if you let me speak.
We have time. We have time here for both of you guys to complete thoughts. This is not cable
Jim,
news.
I have a lot to say on that.
Okay,
question,
fine.
I promise
Go ahead.
you. So I'm gonna talk about that on the question of collusion because it relates to what I want to say about Russia. When we say was there collusion between Trump and Russia, that might mean a lot of different things. I think what it originally meant in 2016 when the Clinton campaign was accusing Trump and his officials of being criminal, and the reason Bob Mueller was ultimately appointed, was there was a notion that Trump actually conspired with the Russians to hack into the email servers of the DNC and John Podesta. That would be a crime. That would be Trump actually working with, as a conspirator with the Russians to commit a crime. It might mean that the Russians did it on their own without Trump's knowledge, and then after the fact came to Trump and said, hey, guess what? We have some really interesting dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of these emails that we would like to give you so that you can use it against her. It might mean that they simply told Trump, hey, we want you to know we got this dirt and we're passing it to the public through WikiLeaks. It could mean any one of those things. So let's say that it meant simply that the Russians told Trump, hey, we have this dirt on Hillary Clinton that we'd like to give you. Is that, if Trump or Trump Jr. or anyone in the Trump campaign said, oh, you have dirt on our opponent, well, and you want to give it to us? Sure, we'd like to take that. Would that be a crime? Would that mean that Trump is an agent of the Russian government? The Politico has this really great story that they wrote after the election in which they reported that Ukrainian officials met with and worked with a contractor for the DNC to give dirt about Donald Trump to the Clinton campaign. And the DNC and the Clinton campaign eagerly accepted it because, of course, you accept dirt about your political opponent, no matter where it comes from. Does that mean that the Clinton campaign was an agent of the Ukrainian government or that they criminally colluded with the Ukrainian government? So the idea of collusion to me, it's a word that doesn't actually exist in the law. And I think we have to be very careful about what it is that we mean. If all we mean is Trump Jr. was willing to accept some dirt about Hillary Clinton from the Russians, that's zillions of universes away from treason. And it also wouldn't mean that Donald Trump is an agent of the Russian government or anything like that. It would simply mean that he accepted help the way that the Democrats were willing to accept help from the Ukrainian officials in order to get dirt on their opponent. On the question
Wait,
of
Glenn,
whether
can we break these into pieces? Let's take the collusion and then we'll come back to you for the next one. Let's just get Jim's response on.
All right, let's pause it.
Issue.
I want him to answer the question.
All right, and remember, we need to go into take it out of the full. Yep,
Yeah.
there we go. Let's not do that.
Here we go.
Yeah, there we go. All right, working out the technical kinks here, guys. Yeah, so I think that's probably as good a spot to answer to pause as any. I will note, I think that the Glenn is the stronger personality here, so James has talked like 1 minute for every 10 minutes of Glenn, but you know, I think there is some interesting stuff that's going on in this first segment, and that like is interesting to look back on now, because like that we maybe have some perspective on like the original factual issue, but like we can just kind of look at the broader stuff going on here. So do you have any initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing sort of like feels relevant to follow up on like what I was saying about Glenn at the beginning too, which is like, while I've heard that like he said crazy things here and there, like the Trump Russia narrative, I think, like in my opinion, James Risen wasn't the only one who like did a lot of really sloppy, sometimes like borderline conspiratorial, like conspiracy theory type style journalism about this story. There were stories about it like every day for a while. And people like in Nation magazine, even, who I really respected, were making a lot of like factual claims without evidence. So I think that Glenn kind of sets this up. Well, or it's set up like the first part of this debate is really about like, if he did collude, is that treason, right? And I thought it was interesting how, again, first of all, just note the frustration of like all the other ways Trump broke the law, including with, corruption with other countries, violating the emoluments clause, campaign fine and whatever. But given that we're here, like, in that piece, James Risen uses this phrase, like, it would be an almost textbook case of treason if he did this, and then they go through the law in this debate, and he's like, whoa, I just meant, like, colloquially, it would be considered treason. But, like, you used the phrase textbook.
Right.
Textbook treason is not, like, colloquially, just like,
what's the textbook, like, if this isn't a legal textbook, what kind of textbook are we talking about here? I think that's a fair point. I mean, I was kind of thinking about that and going back and forth about it a little bit in my own head as we were watching, because I think there is something to the idea that it's not always like limiting a concept, saying like, okay, the only thing the concept can possibly mean is what it means in the law, right? Like, is, I think, probably something that we wouldn't always agree with. Like, I don't know, like corruption, right? That's a good one, right? Like there can be like corruption laws, but like, is that really, but does that really make it like illegitimate to talk about corruption, in any other, to say like, I don't know, the Citizens United legalized corruption or whatever, right? Like that's, or like even like war crimes, right? Like if we, like, because people will make these like sort of legalistic arguments that's like, oh, you can't say that like this or that the United States did counts as a war crime because the U.S. isn't a signatory to, to whatever convention, and therefore, it's actually not legally binding, and and then it's not legally binding, on the United States because that's, so, and it's like, yeah, okay, but I think that, like, I think the concept might have a larger application. So I was kind of all ready to run this like devil's advocate kind of defensive Risen on this, but the more I thought about it, I was like, I still think no, right? Because like, one, that textbook thing line you're pointing to, I think that's a really good point. Like, it's like, we like literally, what does that mean at this point? And two, if the whole thing is, I think way too much here is riding on this word adversary, right? Because it's like, okay, so you're not talking about enemies in the war sense, right? You mean adversary in the sense of like countries that U.S. foreign policy is like at loggerheads with in some sense.
Right.
And it's like, like, is that like, that's that seems like a really sketchy thing to like, it's like, I don't know, man. I mean, look here, let me, as unwise as this may be for me to do in public as as like the Donald Trump is returning to being in control of the Justice Department. Like, here's a case that I'm a traitor, right? This clip may in the future be played in court. But like, Cuba is surely a country that American foreign policy is like at loggerheads with, right? If anyone is, right? I mean, it's like surely Cuba. I've been to Cuba. I've visited it. I went to a conference there, and I've also like written all kinds of shit about how we should lift the embargo, right? Like, is that treason? Like, that's that actually does seem like a really bad way to throw around that term. Like, and it also just reminds me of like the way that people will, like, when they're making pro-Israel arguments, they'll make this huge deal of like, well, Israel's an American ally. It's like, yeah, but that's like what we're kind of arguing about, right? Whether it should be.
Yeah. Yeah, and like there can still be corruption and like whatever, and maybe more so. But yeah, and I mean, I would agree with the first part. I mean, I remember when I was younger, I wrote a piece about like, oh God, I think it was for Counterpunch. It was called like, "What is a Terrorist?" And looked at like this report on the FBI subdivision of the domestic counterterrorism program. I believe it was. I think it was James F. Jarboe was the official. And we looked at it. It was like what they did. They described terrorists as like political actors who oppose. They call them special interest extremists who oppose national security. And when you look at it, what those special interest extremists are, who they're looking at as terrorists, like Earth First, like Greenpeace, like Save the Animals, or I don't know if that's a real one.
Right. I got you.
Occupy. But yeah, so like
that is
like
that is funny because it's like, don't get me wrong, that sounds like a good article, but also like if I were just gonna do like an autocomplete on the sentence, my first article in Counterpunch as a young man was that would be the end of the autocomplete at the end of the sentence. What count? Who are the real terrorists, or what counts as a terrorist?
You're right. There you go. Yeah, you got to start somewhere.
No. It's I think that is a perfectly respectable.
It also makes your point too.
It's just a very like young leftist article, but it's like, no, I mean, like it doesn't mean it's wrong.
yeah, totally. But it also makes your point of like, if we were to limit ourselves to like using that word the way that like law enforcement does, like we'd have to agree that like Ben and I are the terrorists, basically.
Right.
Like so
well, yeah.
But I think I lost another thought.
Well, okay. Well, before we
Ryzen,
you got it?
Ryzen makes a very specific claim,
right?
Which is the main difference. He is using it the way that
I mean, if you're saying it's a textbook case, not just like that, seems different from like, I mean, even with something like corruption, right? Like if you say this is a textbook case of it, right? Then it's like I think you either owe it. Yeah, if you're not using the term in a legal sense, then it's like I think you owe it to your readers to like spell out the sense that you have in mind, and do better than like friendly to adversaries, which is like again a word that I don't love because it's like it's supposed to sound like enemies, but it doesn't quite mean enemies.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, before we provide any more clips to play in court in the future, let's continue the debate.
Yeah, sure.
That I asked him, which was, do you believe
nailed it
that the Russians intervened in the 2016 election to help Trump? Because let me just say one thing was over time, your position seems to have changed dramatically. last year, it seemed that you thought all of this was a hoax. But more recently, you seem to, as I said, in kind of throwaway lines in your pieces, accept much of the idea that the Russians intervened. At the same time, you're attacking people for making too big of a deal of it. And so that, to me, I am confused as a reader of you, and I think a lot of people are confused about what your basic belief now is. Do you believe that the Russians intervened in the 2016 election?
So again, I think first of all, I just want to say, it's extremely easy to characterize what someone's view is without actually quoting them or specifying where they supposedly said it, which is why I've been extremely careful whenever I've been characterizing your arguments to actually quote what it is you said. That. Because the idea that I ever thought or said that it was a hoax that Russia was meddling in the election is completely false. I never said anything like that. It's the same thing that I say now, which is that the lesson of the Iraq War, for sure, when it seemed like there was a whole bunch of evidence because it was appearing on the front page of the New York Times, quoting foreign officials and intelligence officials with not firsthand knowledge and all of that about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction and his alliance with Al-Qaeda. The lesson is that we shouldn't believe claims from the US government absent convincing evidence, meaning not anonymous sources inside of governments making assertions without underlying corroboration, but actual tangible evidence that we can see and assess for ourselves in order to make that assessment. And so when the US government came out in January of 2017 and first said that Vladimir Putin personally ordered the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta, I agreed with what Masha Gessen wrote. She, of course, is a Russian expatriate and a very hardcore critic of Putin. And she said, after months of anticipation, speculation, and hand-wringing by politicians and journalists, American intelligence agencies have finally released a declassified version of a report on the part they believe Russia played in the US presidential election. A close reading of the report shows that it barely supports such a conclusion. Indeed, it barely supports any conclusion. There is not much to read. The declassified version is 25 pages, of which 2 are blank, 4 are decorative, 1 contains an explanation of terms, 1 a table of contents, and 7 are a previously published unclassified report by the CIA's open source division on RT. There is even less to process. The report adds hardly anything to what we have already knew. So my problem with this claim from the beginning was that it was unaccompanied by any evidence. I think there is now some evidence that Russia did things in the election to, and I think it's a question of what their motive is. I think the Mueller indictment contains some details about 13 Russians who apparently created some fake Facebook pages and Twitter accounts and political tweets that, in contrast to what you claimed was their motive, which was to help elect Donald Trump, the Mueller indictment says it wasn't that. It was to sow divisions within the United States, that they were also supportive of Bernie Sanders, of Jill Stein, that they were really interested in sowing division. That was the motive that they attributed to the people that they indicted.
They were trying to hurt Clinton and help Trump, and that during the primaries they were supporting opponents of Clinton.
Okay, well, people can go read it. The motive that Mueller attributes in those indictments was to actually sow divisions. I think the theory is that nobody thought Trump was going to win, that Clinton was going to win, and they wanted to weaken her. So when you ask me, do I believe now that Russia played a role in the election, or has my views changed? My view has never changed. My view is exactly the same, which is I'm not going to accept claims until there's evidence for them. I think there is some evidence in the form of Bob Mueller's accusations in an indictment, which are yet to be tried in court, and lots of times prosecutors' accusations are proven to be false or don't have evidence, that they did some things like putting up Facebook ads and Twitter accounts and some poorly attended political events. I still don't see any evidence, other than some anonymously leaked claims, that Vladimir Putin ordered the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta's emails, which, remember, was the original controversy that led to the appointment of a special counsel into this entire controversy. It wasn't about Twitter bots or Facebook page ads. It was that Vladimir Putin personally ordered and directed the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta. And part of the evidence that I actually find most persuasive is what Putin's opponents in Russia are saying. There was a great article in the Times in November. There was one in the New Yorker in July that described how Putin's liberal pro-Western opponents in Russia are indignant over this idea that Putin is some kind of mastermind who controls everything going on in Russia. They said that that's the image that he wants to propagate, but it's the opposite of reality. There's an endless number of competing factions in Russia who do all kinds of things at cross purposes with one another. It's basically an autocratic, oligarchical mess, and not some really well-oiled machine.
Let me put this to both of you.
So no, I don't think that there is very convincing evidence on the core claim.
Well, I think, but I think
Putin
what you've
ordered those hacking.
But I
even
think
though
what you've just
there's some
said
evidence
is-
that some Russians did some social media activity.
I think what you've just said is something that is very important, which is that you've now said straight out that you think the Russians did intervene in some way in the 2016 election. And I think that many people who have read you, and I know that you this is a big issue for you because I've looked at your Twitter feed, and there's a lot of fights you have with people who interpret what you say, and you get angry at them on Twitter for accusing you of certain things. But you and I are in the communications business, and if the preponderance of what you write is interpreted by a large number of your readers in a certain way, and it's not what you intended, then you failed as a communicator.
Well, wait, hold on.
So,
I think that's a little bit unfair, Jim.
No. Let me
I mean,
finish.
look at the groupthink that goes on TV these days.
No. My only point is, I'm not talking about a groupthink. I'm talking about, have you accurately communicated what you really believe over the last year?
Totally. If you were to, let me just say,
Because you're now saying that that's always
the idea that if people attribute to you things that you didn't say, it means that you failed as a communicator, I think is preposterous.
No, it's not.
It might mean that the reason people are attributing to me things I never said is because I'm a poor communicator. It might be because there's an attempt to smear people who don't get on board with the prevailing orthodoxy. In 2002, opponents of the Iraq War were constantly accused of being admirers of Saddam Hussein. Were they?
My only point is that
they weren't. There's lots of motives why people attribute things to other people that aren't what they said. And if you go back and look at what I write, and I recently compiled it, from the very first moment I began writing about this story, I always said the same thing, which is actually something that you said in your own article that I agree with, which is that, of course, it's possible, even plausible, that there was some attempt by the Russians to destabilize the U.S. election, because that's something that the U.S. and the Russians have been doing to one another forever. So, I mean, I would never put it past Putin or the Russian intelligence services, oh, they're too ethical, or, oh, they're too restrained to try and disseminate division and disinformation within the American polity. That's something that these two countries have done to everybody. So it's never been the case that I've denied it or said it was a hoax.
Okay,
I
but
just wanted
let me
to
just
see
say
evidence for it as a
you
journalist.
You are a very talented writer, and you are a good communicator, and you are incredibly smart. And yet you must know that over the past year, the preponderance of what you've written has been interpreted by most people who I think are reasonable readers, that you are among the people who deny the existence of the Russian involvement in the election or collusion. That is the overwhelming interpretation of what you've written by most people.
But Tim, the pushback on that is, and I want to ask you this, where is your evidence of collusion? Not in a legal term. I'm just talking about
the way people perceive what Glenn has written.
Yes, but I think then Glenn can rightly say to them, well, you show me the evidence. For instance, if it turns out that all of the forensic investigations that happened are actually not correct, or there's flaws in how they determine that it's Russian hackers that did this, then the whole thing goes out the window. Let me just read from Jeffrey
No,
Carr, who is not some
go ahead.
flaming leftist here. He says, there is not now and has never been a single piece of technical evidence produced that connects the malware used in the DNC attack to the GRU, FSB, or any agency of the Russian government. Now, Jeffrey Carr may be wrong, but there is a compelling case to be made that FireEye and CrowdStrike selectively presented evidence and left out huge swaths of details that lately the AP has gone into and looked at that showed, as you mentioned earlier, a very wide canvas that the Russians were striking on that included military people, people working on drones. To me, the central question is, if the Russians did hack it, and they were behind the DNC, then you have an issue where they're saying, how are we going to disseminate this to achieve our political aims? But if the entire thing is based on BS, on a forensic level, then this entire conversation is almost pointless.
No, I agree with that. And I think one of the best pieces of evidence that's come out recently was something I mentioned in the story. In the Dutch media, two major news organizations in Holland wrote an amazing stories about how Dutch intelligence had real-time access, hacking into the systems of the Russian hackers who were behind the DNC hack.
Well, let's just read from it. There were articles in Die Volkskrant. So their story was based on anonymous sources.
On who?
On anonymous sources. They're based on anonymous sources, as much of this reporting is, including in this country, for reasons we can debate and discuss. But just in the effort of expediency here, according to the paper, hackers from AIVD, the Dutch General Intelligence and Security Service, penetrated the network of the Russian hacker group known as Cozy Bear in the summer of 2014. Then, according to that article, Cozy Bear, which is also known as Advanced Persistent Threat 29, worked from a space in a university building near the Red Square. The Dutch hackers, this story says, didn't just watch what Cozy Bear was doing, but they were also hacked into the security camera that recorded all of the comings and goings. Just to give context, that's what Jim is talking about.
Did they? So I'm sorry, you said so it's based on anonymous sources. No one's name is attached to those claims. Like, we don't know. There's no way to know.
No, I mean, they're officials from Dutch intelligence, and they, according to this Dutch story, which hasn't been contradicted since then, they passed on all their evidence to the NSA and to the U.S. intelligence community.
Did anybody reporting this story show any of this physical evidence, like any of the
I don't
pictures
know.
that were
I don't
taken, or the? I haven't seen any of it. Have you?
No, I haven't.
We can go down the lane of arguing about anonymous sources and government sources. People can make up their own minds about it. The point is that this was in a major respected newspaper, as many of the allegations against Trump are in this country, in terms of how the broader public views this, and so it is being taken seriously. There is no proof for it. It is just the allegations of officials talking to the most important publications in the Netherlands.
And that's my point, Jeremy, is the New York Times is actually a really important, well-respected paper too. And if in 2002 we were having this debate and about whether or not Saddam had weapons of mass destruction or had an alliance with Al-Qaeda, Jim could say, and he would be 1,000% right, that look, there's these really detailed, definitive, compelling claims and highly respected papers detailing the exact nature of Saddam's weapons program and his alliance with Al-Qaeda. And I'm not saying that means that every story that is based on anonymous sources is false. It's not. There's some really good reporting based on anonymous sources. But at the very least, I think we all have to agree, and I believe that the three of us have all agreed in the past, that one of the lessons of the Iraq War has to be that we should be highly skeptical when Western intelligence agencies make self-serving claims through the media while hiding behind a shield of anonymity and aren't offering the underlying corroborating evidence to assess it.
I agree. So, yes, I agree completely with that. And I was at the New York Times while the WMD debacle was happening. I tried to fight it, and it was a horrible experience. And you're absolutely right to be skeptical. I've always tried to be skeptical. In this case, I believe that you can also go too far the other way and not be open enough to facts as they emerge. And what I find compelling today is that there are a number of facts coming from a number of different sources, both in the U.S. government, outside the government, in foreign press. The Intercept has received anonymously documents that the government didn't want us to have, that all point to a fairly strong conclusion that the Russians intervened in the election. I don't believe that there is the same level of evidence to prove collusion. I don't think we're anywhere close to proving collusion yet.
But Jim, let's say that we allow, or we all, just for the sake of argument, agree that the Russians spent money on social media campaigns that were aimed at trying to stop Hillary Clinton from becoming president. Let's say that we all take that on its surface. Let's also say that we take on its surface that Russia was behind the hacking of the DNC and the dissemination of those emails. But there is no evidence that links Trump to any involvement in this. Isn't that
into the original hack?
Right, into the original hack. You know, I mean, everybody uses opposition research that's gained in all sorts of dirty ways. But isn't the whole point here? Doesn't the entire thing rest on the idea that Trump participated in this, or that senior Trump people did? And
I think
there's a lot of lies that are suspicious, and I want to ask Glenn about some of that.
Right.
But to ask you, Jim, isn't it necessary to show that they actually participated in a criminal conspiracy?
Yes, I agree with that. And
there isn't any evidence of that right now.
To me, we're at phase one in my reporting is trying to get even more fundamental. Did the Russians do anything? Did they intervene? Because if that's not true, then everything else falls apart, including collusion.
But let's say we all agree on that. Now, what do you do with the fact that there isn't anything linking Trump in them?
To me, that's the big hole in the whole story. I think there is fairly strong evidence that the Russians intervened in some way in the election. Whether it made much of a difference in the election is, to me, a different question. The other part that I think is fairly clear is that Trump and the people around him have engaged in some form of effort to impede.
Okay, I keep waiting for a good natural stopping point, but I think we should just stop. So yeah, this is, I mean, I think that my main thought of the very last part, especially, but a lot of this so far is, and it's weird because I mean, like it's been years since I've really thought about this, that, everybody on various sides was completely obsessed with it for so long, but now it's like, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that, huh? And it was definitely giving me some flashbacks since basically, I mean, this debate is from 2018, which is like kind of I feel like that's like kind of around the end of when Russiagate was a really big thing, right? Like I'd have to like go back and check the timeline, but like
peak Russiagate, pre-COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I guess 2000, because I can kind of remember like when it felt like it was dying down, which was like late 2018, early 2019.
Fair.
But I like during most of this time, which is kind of funny because it's like this is like, as you say, peak Russiagate is kind of just before I started to do like public facing political stuff. I mean, like I wrote some early articles for Counterpunch and whatnot, right? But like but like in a bigger way, right? Like I really, I started doing videos for Zero Books in like fall 2018. And then the Michael Brooks Show stuff started in like early 2019, and Jacobin started in like I don't know, kind of end of the summer 2019. And so all of which is to say that like in a big public way, I just kind of sort of missed Russiagate. Like I did like one video about it for Zero Books. I think maybe when the Mueller report came out, the point of the video was just kind of like, okay, guys, this was really dumb. Let's move on now. But but I wasn't really like in it because again, that was kind of just before I started doing public stuff. Really, like, so my memory of Russiagate is that I spent like 3 years getting into a lot of really annoying arguments with my liberal friends on Facebook. That was my level of involvement with it, and and it's like, and part of the danger of that is that it's like what a lot of what I can remember from that is that there end up being all this drift back and forth about like what the subject is we're even arguing about, and it's like, so this stuff toward the end, it's like, I don't know, is there Russian involvement in the election? It's like, seems like a really uninteresting question to me. It's like, yeah, of course, right? I mean, there's like, I'm sure there could not be a presidential election in the most important, like, powerful country in the world without probably dozens of foreign countries like making some effort to influence it in some way or another, right? I mean, that's like, that's just kind of a, yeah, of course, whatever, right? I mean, it's like, I would be very surprised if Russia's level of like, even in terms of the amount of resources they put into that, never mind the payoff they got, like, I'd be very surprised if Russia was in like the top 10 countries that, for like meddling in US elections. Like, I would think like Israel, Saudi Arabia, right? Places like this, like, are able to have like way more influence on American politics than Russia does.
Not to mention, not that anybody gives a shit about this, I guess, but not to mention what we do, to other countries. Like,
oh my God, yeah.
I mean, Bill Clinton campaigned for Boris Yeltsin in Russia.
Yeah, well, I mean, and actually, I mean, it's kind of funny because, in a way, I mean, I always thought if it had turned out that Putin was, I mean, and look, if you want to make a really technical case here, like the case that like Russian meddling made Trump president is that the 2016 election was so insanely close that there are like 200 factors that like if any one of them had changed, the outcome would have changed. Like the slightest wind in Wisconsin somewhere would have changed the result. So it's like, yeah,
butterfly effect.
Yeah. So like, yeah, if you want to say Putin butterfly affected Trump into office, I guess you can say that, but it's like,
he's the butterfly.
but like, it's that's just kind of not a very interesting claim, right? But it's like, I always thought, look, if it turned out that Putin actually did conspire with Trump to like do some like big dramatic illegal thing to put Trump in office, that would kind of, and thus defeat a member of the Clinton family, that would kind of be karmic justice, because Putin, of course, was the handpicked successor of Boris Yeltsin, who really did steal the election in 1996 in Russia, and like with lots of U.S. help.
Yeah.
From the Clinton administration, right? So that's
exactly. Yeah. It wasn't the only thing they did, but yeah, like, but also that actually leads me to a question I have, which is like, and I remember at the time we tried to find it before this, but it's so long ago that it seems like it's kind of buried. But I think I remember Juan Cole writing a piece for in 2016.
Oh, that's a name I haven't heard in many years.
Juan Cole?
Yeah.
He's a good writer, dude. He's a good.
No. I mean, I'm not even bashing Juan Cole. It's just kind of funny. It's like I feel like I used to hear people talk about him all the time, but I haven't for a long time.
He's a good writer, yeah, and he wrote a piece that like I didn't really see anybody else write anywhere about this, which was that like actually, I mean, lots of people on the left disagree with the Trump-Russia narrative for lots of reasons, but he was the only one who was like, actually think Putin would prefer Clinton. And he made a case for like why it's fairly implausible, that largely revolves around just their lack of experience with Trump, and like they know people who know the Clintons, like they know diplomats who have worked with her. They're probably much more comfortable with that than this wild card who's a Republican and might just like, who knows, But Yeah, so that leads me to a question for you is like, do you think that, and let's talk pre-Biden, because I
Sure.
think introducing Biden makes it more complicated. But as of
Right.
this conversation from 2016 to 2018, do you think Putin actually would have preferred Trump if it was up to him, if he could have picked?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that he might have. I mean, I think that's not look. It's not implausible to say that I mean, Hillary Clinton had been Obama's Secretary of State, and it's oh no. Okay, sorry about that. Hillary Clinton had been Obama's Secretary of State, and so sure, I mean, I take the Juan Cole point that means that he'd worked with her before, but that also means that it's not like that time period when Hillary was Secretary of State was a time when like everything was going great between the United States and Russia, right?
And Juan Cole accepts that at the start. Like, I understand she's a hawk on Russia and Syria and all these related things, but
so I at least don't find it implausible that Putin would have preferred Trump to Clinton. That although it's like yeah, he's more of a wild card. There's more chaos there, but but maybe if he's at least chaotic and incompetent, right? Then as our big geopolitical rival, that'll sort of work out well for us. Like I don't know that was the calculation exactly, but I could it's not crazy to me that he could have thought that, right? I mean, I guess that's the real question, right? It's like by 2016, was Putin more worried about the dangers of a more chaotic United States, or was he more like, these people have it in for us regardless? We should just the less competent leadership they have, the better, right? And I could actually kind of see that going the other way, and if it doesn't, I mean, I guess the public evidence is that they were trying, in some bizarre, incompetent way, right? And by the way, if anybody's actually seen these, Facebook ads from the Internet Research Agency, I do not actually think they swat on a lot of American voters, right? As this was a really low effort intervention, but
I gotta say that Bernie Sanders with the 6-pack abs, that changed my mind.
Yeah.
I voted for Bernie because of that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm the one who's swung.
Yeah. It's like the day that we finally find the Trump voter who's swayed by Liz Cheney to vote for Kamala Harris.
Right.
Yeah. No, exactly. So it's like so it kind of looks like there was this incredibly feeble effort to help candidates either in the primaries or Trump in the general who were going against Clinton. Is my understanding, which would suggest that that he preferred Trump. Although I also think that the Juan Cole argument isn't crazy either. Like, I mean, I totally get in principle why somebody in Putin's position might prefer Clinton. But it's also possible. I think Glenn kind of said that in part of what we just watched, that he thought Clinton's gonna be president regardless. Let's at least kind of let's at least make it a little hard for her, or stir the pot, and get whatever we're going to get out of that. And he didn't really think that, Trump was going to win, which would be very plausible, because nobody thought Trump was going to win, very much including Trump. Right? I mean, this is, if you actually remember from 2016, Trump literally did not have a victory party planned on election night. Right, he didn't have a speech written because he didn't think he was going to win.
Epic. Oh my god. Yeah. That reminded me of another question I have for you, but I think I lost it.
Okay, well let's do it next time we pause. Let's get back to it.
The Comey firing and a number of other things all lead to the suggestion that you might be able to build some kind of a case of obstruction. What's
Well, in fact,
missing-
you've said that is one perfectly plausible scenario, that none of the underlying allegations are proven in court, but that several people, if not many people, end up going down on charges that they obstructed justice or they lied to federal investigators.
And that's a very typical thing to happen in Washington scandals, like in Iran-Contra or things like that. You know, people go to jail for lying to the FBI, or not for some underlying crime. And so that's, to me, that could be where we end up. I think collusion is going to be very difficult to prove. I don't claim that the proof is there. I think there's a lot of interesting evidence, and there's a lot of things to continue to investigate. But I don't think we're there yet, and we may never get there. I'm not sure it exists.
Glenn, how do you then reckon with the fact that it seems like key people around Trump have repeatedly lied, including about very significant episodes that are in the spotlight right now, and that the president himself is regularly lying in a demonstrable way on Twitter? Doesn't it strike you as a bit odd that they all seem to be constantly sort of lying about any contacts with Russians whatsoever?
No, it doesn't strike me as odd at all that Donald Trump and his closest aides and advisors are pathological liars. I would expect nothing less. I think Trump has always been that. If you talk to anybody in New York real estate or in banking or in Atlantic City who has dealt with him in any capacity, they will all tell you that that's what he and everybody around him is and has always been. So I want to address that in 1 second, but I just want to address this kind of overarching point first, like the kind of atmospheric journalism point about this idea that, well, there's been a focus on when media outlets get stories wrong, like the Washington Post says the Russians hacked the electric system, or the Dutch foreign minister, or that lied about his meeting with Putin, in which Putin said that Greater Russia includes Ukraine and Belarus and other former Soviet states. I think it matters a lot that we not succumb to this idea that it's okay to serve this kind of broader truth by getting lots of things wrong along the way. That's the concept that Stephen Colbert in the Bush era mocked as truthiness. We're saying false things, but it's in service of this bigger truth. And I think it is really dangerous when you have two nuclear-armed powers who have almost annihilated this species on several occasions, who still have Cold War nuclear war systems in place, to heighten tension through bad reporting, through falsehoods, through lies. I think it fuels Trump's attacks on the media. I think it sows distrust in journalism. And I think it's a really important role for journalists to play, to say what this official said is untrue. What that media outlet reported was reckless and wrong and misled a lot of people. And to do that doesn't mean that I or other people who are doing it are saying there's nothing there. What we're saying is we ought to be journalistically faithful to the facts and not be inflammatory and reckless. And I think it matters when people in positions of power and influence get things really wrong. On the question of Trump lying, sometimes people lie to cover up crimes. Many other times they lie for other reasons besides covering up crimes. And I think there's no question Trump and lots of people close to Trump have repeatedly lied about the core questions of this case. They're meeting with Russian officials and a whole bunch of other related issues. But think about it. When Trump got elected and the allegations of the Democrats was that he colluded with the Russians or that the Russians helped him, he's very sensitive about that because it threatens the legitimacy of his win. It could be just for political reasons. They wanted to minimize their contacts with the Russians because they think it's politically harmful if they're seen as dealing too much with the Russians. So I could see them easily reflexively lying in order to protect themselves from political harm. That's just as plausible to me as that they're lying continuously in order to cover up underlying crimes, for which I think we're all in basic agreement that there's not very much evidence, at least as of yet.
Yeah, go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on the point you made. I agree with you that it's really valuable for you to write about the media on these issues and to call them to account. And I think that's valuable. I'm not suggesting that it's not. What I'm suggesting is that for the most part, that's been the way that you have dealt with this story. And I find it difficult to find a place in your reporting where you just straight out laid out what you really believe about the case.
That's because my views of what happened are always going to be based on the available evidence. And thus far, I think the available evidence has been extremely weak to non-existent. It's non-existent on whether Putin specifically ordered this. It's extremely weak to non-existent on whether the Russian government actually did the hacking of the Podesta and the DNC emails. I think there's some evidence now that they were active in doing fake social media accounts, whether how linked they were to the government, how centralized that were. I think those are all open questions. So I don't think that journalism only means making affirmative claims based on shoddy evidence.
Well, but Glenn,
it's a really important journalistic service to say there's no evidence for these claims and therefore we shouldn't believe them yet. And that is the position that I've taken from the start.
Now, Glenn, you fairly regularly now appear on Fox News.
Did Putin get Trump elected? We still don't know. We did recently speak, though, to progressive journalist Glenn Greenwald, who said the press is replacing good reporting with inaccurate scandal mongering.
We can talk about why that is and the strategy involved there. I will say, in fairness, I know that you are not exactly having your door banged down by MSNBC to be on these days. But I don't want to get yet into the issue of Fox News, but I do want to play a clip of something that you said on Laura Ingram's show last December. Let's listen.
If people were just making mistakes journalistically because they were rushing or because human beings are fallible, as we all are, you would expect roughly 50% of the mistakes to go in one direction and 50% of the mistakes to go in the other direction. And what you're seeing in this story is the exact opposite. Virtually 100% of the mistakes that outlets like CNN and the Washington Post and MSNBC make are designed to undermine and subvert Donald Trump and to bolster the Russia-Trump story, just like all of Fox's mistakes are in the opposite direction.
Okay, so let's then do a kind of thought experiment, okay? Let's say you were me, and your view of the story is what I myself have said from the start it is, which is that as journalists and as citizens, we shouldn't believe claims until there's evidence furnished to prove that those claims are true, convincing evidence. Thus far, with regard to the accusations that Putin ordered the hacking of the DNC and John Podesta's emails, there is very little to no actual convincing evidence that that's true. And therefore, we shouldn't believe that that claim is true. What you call a caveat is actually a really important part of what I think, which is that, of course, it's possible that Putin did it. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But as a journalist, I don't think it matters what I believe, as though I'm some kind of like a medium, psychically intuiting what actually happened. I think that my role as a journalist is supposed to be to evaluate convincing evidence and then report to my readers what it is that happened based not on my beliefs, but on the actual evidence.
Well, have you done any reporting on this?
Yeah, I think it is reporting, Jim, to say that there's the evidence that's being offered by the United States government is extremely unconvincing. One of my journalistic heroes, another one of them, is Izzy Stone, who basically did that all the time. That's what he did. He got reporting from mainstream media. He compared it to what the actual evidence was that they were citing. And then he highlighted all of the huge holes in what the actual evidence was that was being cited by the government and the media to demonstrate why the claims were extremely unpersuasive. That is journalism. That is a really
that's fine. I'm just saying I come away from reading what you've written confused. And
what are you confused about? Let's clarify it now.
I'm confused by what you really by what you're trying to say. Frankly,
Okay,
I'm confused.
I'm trying to say that as rational citizens and good journalists, we should not believe claims from the U.S. government about things that happen, especially inflammatory claims about their adversaries, absent convincing evidence that we can assess and review rationally. And that with regard to the core claims of the Russia-Trump story, the core claims that from the beginning have spawned the controversy, namely that Putin ordered the hacking of the DNC and Podesta email inboxes, there is little to no convincing evidence that that's true.
Well, I think
I've always said there should be a full investigation, which is what I really want to happen, where all of this evidence is put forth in a way that we don't have to rely on anonymous leaks and little snippets and self-serving people leaking certain parts for whatever their agenda is that we can't really assess. That we should actually one day be able to see all of the evidence so that we know what really happened here. But until such time, we should be skeptical about these claims.
I agree
and
with
then
that.
The other
I
part
agree.
Of my,
I-
okay,
I-
well,
I
that's,
have-
that's my view.
I
don't
agree
see
with
why you're confused.
skepticism of the intelligence community. I think my career speaks to that.
I agree. It does. I think that one of the issues with our difference here is that in general, and it's a virtue of your national security reporting, you tend to stay away from politics. And I think that you are severely underestimating the political strain that runs through how people perceive this story, the extreme importance that Democrats have placed in believing that this Russia story is true, because it helps them explain a very disorienting and complicated set of events that led to someone like Donald Trump being elected president. It excuses the failures of their own party because they get to place the blame on a foreign villain instead of accepting it for themselves. And it makes it a really important political tactic in 2018 and 2020 to say that Donald Trump aided and abetted the Russians.
Well, and
so
also, Glenn, just quickly, small detail about this. Jim, the night you were on Chris Hayes' show on MSNBC, two guests on that program that night compared what we know about Russian interference or allegations of Russian interference to the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
This is a very serious attack against the United States by a hostile foreign power, an attack against our election process. Imagine if FDR had denied that the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor and didn't react. That's the equivalent.
I do think this is equivalent of Pearl Harbor.
You have an enormous amount of exaggeration and very sweeping declarations about how serious this is in the context of American history that just fall apart if you examine the underlying.
I agree with that.
Let Glenn finish this.
So I think that number one is, I don't think you should underestimate. There definitely are good faith critics of my reporting. I think you're one, which is why I've taken an hour and however many minutes of my day debating this with you. But please do not underestimate the extent to which there are political operatives and highly partisan people who are looking to construe what I've said in the least generous light possible.
Fair enough.
Because politically, it's very important for them to discredit me as one of the people who has been most vocal in expressing skepticism about these stories.
But Glenn, you go on Fox News to do it.
I go on Democracy Now! To do it.
Yeah,
I go on CNN
I know,
to do it.
but let's not compare. Fox News is an absolute lie factory. It was before this, and it will be after it. Now, I've joined you in all of the criticism of MSNBC and CNN. But just to put out personally where I stand on this, I wouldn't go on Fox News unless a big part of my point was going after and attacking Fox News. This is a strategic difference you and I have. Yes, you've done it at times. You did it on Laura Ingram's show. But a lot of the times when you're on Tucker Carlson's show, Glenn, and he is, I think he is one of the more rabid and dangerous people, particularly on issues of race in this country. You go on his show and you do not make it a point to go after him for those things that filter into what is actually going on in this country and what we should be standing in opposition to. So I find that curious.
Jeremy, you know what? I'm not a performing monkey who goes on to TV to entertain people or to prove a point to them. If I go on a TV program, for example, you go on Bill Maher and have gone on Bill Maher continuously. The last time you said you weren't going to go on because Milo was on, but before that you went on all the time with him, even though he's incredibly bigoted and racist and horrible in all kinds of ways. And, I presume you do that because you believe that the things you're saying are important and you want to have a platform and reach the most number of people that you can in order to do them. So if I go on a TV program and a host asks me a question about my views, I'm going to answer them truthfully and not calculate, let me try and go out of my way to prove to good liberals that I'm not really a Fox conservative. My view, I've spoken at the Cato Institute, I've spoken at Marxist conventions. My view has always been that if you believe in the things that you're saying and you think they're important, you should go to as many people as possible and as many platforms as possible in order to be heard and try and persuade people of what it is that you're saying. And just to address that last point that Jim made, I do think that the thing that Jeremy just said is the thing underlying this most for me, Jim, which is that there is this heightened war rhetoric now. When you have Democrats comparing what the Russians did to 9/11, which led to 17 years of endless war and an erosion of civil liberties, and World War and Pearl Harbor, which led to the nuking of Japan, I think the rhetoric is getting really dangerous. And so a big part of what I've done is try and rein that in out of concern that we're just going to unintentionally end up in a new Cold War.
I think that gets to the heart of the difference in how you and I approach this story. And I am trying to approach it journalistically. I've been a reporter all my life. This is the first time I've been a columnist, really. And so I'm trying to do it based on, what is this as a story, a news story? And I think you, as an advocate, with your background in advocacy, I think you approach it as a political question. I think you're looking at it as a political problem that has a lot of political consequences for the country. And it certainly does, but that's a different approach to the way I'm trying to look at it. I'm just trying to do this. Is this a really good story? Yes, it's a good news story. And I think you see it as this is a political threat to the way in which your political agenda, which is a very valid way to look at it. It's just different from mine.
I do see it that way, but I also think I see it journalistically and have tried to look at it through a journalistic lens, which is let's not accept claims without evidence. To me, that is the core of journalism.
No, I
totally agree.
Yeah.
And I totally agree that I see a political angle to it, and that it's been important to me, that political angle. But it's also been an evidentiary one that I think that so many media outlets have gone wrong with.
My point is, I think I told you at the beginning, I didn't really get into this story until recently. And it's only because I see the potential gravity of it, and not real. It hasn't had a real large historical significance yet, but it has the potential to be that, and I think that's why it's an important issue.
Well, I know I'm going to be looking forward to reading the next article in Jim Risen's series, and also Glenn, your coming journalism as well. Needless to say, folks, The Intercept is a very interesting place to be working right about now. Glenn Greenwald gets paid in rubles. Jim Risen gets paid in suitcases of cash from the CIA. Just wanted to make sure we got that all on the record. Jim Risen, thanks so much for doing this today. Thanks. Glenn, thank you from Rio de Janeiro.
All right, guys.
All right.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Take care. And thank you, everyone, for watching and listening.
All right. Let's see. Got to get the layout back. There we go. Yeah. This is a really interesting trip down memory lane. I've got to say, from my perspective, and because I do think, right, that the sort of criticism that Scahill was floating at the very end, or was sort of gesturing at the very end, I do think there's something to that, right? That there's that, like, it's like, look, I think that I do think that, I mean, Glenn has lost the plot as far as, like, how to think about American politics, who's the lesser evil, all of that stuff, right? Over the course of, like, I mean, I think in some ways it's an own goal by liberals that, like, I think it's something that happens a lot, actually, that, when you sort of exile people into the outer darkness, because of their transgressions against what you think, and then they start spending time with whoever will still have them, and humans being humans, I think little by little they're influenced by those views, right? And I think that there is, like, a lot of kind of pro-Trump stuff that Glenn says now that I really disagree with, right? Like, so I think when he's like, yeah, you go on Fox all the time and very rarely to disagree with them, right? I think that Glenn is kind of taking that as, oh, you want me to do something performative, but I'm not going to do that because I don't care about that. And it's like, well, no, but it's like, there is a question of, like, what's the like what the overall direction of political drift is. I mean, again, my disagree. Like the last time Glenn was on this show was almost a year ago, and it was like devoted to us arguing about Trump and kind of like who, whether Trump and the Republicans are better or worse in terms of like war and foreign policy stuff, right? So I mean, I'm not saying anything now that I wouldn't say to his face. I mean, I do think that he's had a loss of perspective on some of this stuff. So I think some of what Scahill was like kind of hinting at with that objection is not totally wrong. But like watching this, I was like, yeah, I mean, this is like back when I was like really religiously reading all Glenn's stuff, and the sort of core argument he's making there seemed obviously true to me then, and still seems that way to me now, right? That it's like, no, of course you shouldn't believe things because like anonymous intelligence spooks whisper them in the ear of some journalist without providing any kind of public evidence. Like that's insane. Like, and it doesn't, there's a difference between saying, X is definitely false, or even just X is false, and saying there is not yet sufficient evidence to believe X, right? I mean, like, of course those two things are different. And if you say, I don't think there's enough evidence yet to justify believing X, and people say, oh, so you're saying X is false, I mean, I don't think that like, oh, you must have said something wrong. I think that's just like a lot of partisans will get mad at you if you say things that go against their preferred narrative, and they're not going to interpret it very charitably. So it's like, yeah, I mean, I think on the sort of core issue they're arguing about here, I think Glenn is like, 100% right.
Yeah, and he also does say at the end of that clip, like, just like Fox's mistakes are all wrong in the opposite direction. Is he's comparing to CNN?
No, that's true. That's true. I did catch that. That was actually in that case. I was really glad he stuck that in, right? That little,
Yeah, and he was also invited on to talk about a particular thing. I'd probably object to some of his phrasing. I think the Tucker Carlson point is a little more interesting. And obviously, I think, like, probably the craziest thing Glenn Greenwald has ever said is that Tucker Carlson is a socialist, which happened after this debate. So he certainly, like, and I don't even know what that means, but like, not even to get into that, but like,
no, I mean, we did a whole segment on that on the show at the time. That he said that, which is funny because like we did this whole segment about that at the time, and then Glenn actually shared it on Twitter. He was like, okay, this is like a good faith critique or whatever, but he never really responded to it. Right? It's like, okay, I mean, thank you, it's good faith, but like also on the substance of it, like, do you still think this, right? Because this is, I mean, to me, like, that just seems so very obviously wrong, and I think it goes to, like, I think a lot of where he's gone wrong politically in the last few years, like, my kind of maybe predictable, Marxist take on it is that I think that his problem is that, like, in terms of his overall worldview, like he was never really like that grounded on economic stuff, right? So it was like he kind of, because like, look, I mean, and I'm not saying like people change for the better, it's a good thing, right? But like, as far as I can tell, like he was like, much more right wing earlier in his life, and then like he got, like, it seems like what really, like, the sort of peak Greenwald years from my perspective, right, which are like, I probably started reading him in like 2007, maybe. I was definitely reading him by
Obama.
Yeah, right, exactly, right, the Obama years, right? That's like, because he was like, because he started out, right, like, like I think he was sort of like probably had more conservative views, and I'm just basing that on like what he himself has said about, like, in retrospect when he's looking back at like what he used to think earlier in his life, right? Like, I think he had more conservative views, and then he really started writing and blogging about politics, right? Just back in the blog era, because he was horrified about the about Bush, for all the right reasons. And then, again, I'm trying to remember, because I definitely started reading him when Bush was still president, but I think it was toward the end of it. I was definitely reading him by the 2008 election, but I think I'd started a little while before that, maybe like 2007. But he was, I think the peak Glenn years were the Obama years, because he was mad at Bush for all the right reasons. And then the sort of core reasons he was mad at Bush, which were about basically war and civil liberties, he remained mad about throughout the Obama years, which is great, right? I mean, I actually, in a way, I regard the stance that he was taking from 2008 to 2016, right? The Obama years as admirable and, even kind of heroic as the sort of more famously good journalistic things he's done, Edward Snowden reporting, right? About the NSA leaks, or of course, closer to my heart as a TMBS guy, even than that, right? As the Lava Jato reporting, right, about Brazil. But it's look, I think that, I think he spent the Obama years at war with liberal media types for exactly the best and most honorable reasons that you could do that, which is that basically he was the one guy who was still mad about drones and civil liberties, throughout the Obama. I mean, obviously not literally the only guy. There's you, there's me, there's Noam Chomsky, right? But
Scahill, I mean, probably the
Jerry
best
Scahill,
correspondent of the past couple decades, I think.
Totally, right? So it's I think that's all true. And I also think he got Russiagate 100% right? But I think that part of the problem, and I think Russiagate really deepened, he was already kind of at war for the best and most honorable reasons with these liberal media types throughout the Obama years. And then I think Russiagate was where it went from being a tense relationship to a lot of those people to no, fuck this guy, right? And then my take is that I think that I think at a certain point there's some mission creep, right? So in other words, yeah, I mean, he made all these people his enemies for the best and most honorable possible reasons, but then I think at a certain point over the years, it feels to me, and I'm not saying consciously, I just mean this is a very human thing, right? That it seems to me that at a certain point he kind of made owning those people and showing that they were wrong about everything a goal in and of itself. And I think that's led him to some bad places. I mean, I think that it often feels it's because for a long time now, I mean, the first time I had him on this show was it's late 2020. I think maybe after the election, I don't remember, but it was right after he left The Intercept, basically, right? Which I was also on his side about that. I actually thought he had a legitimate complaint, about the way that his original employment agreement was being violated there. But I think at that point, I remember there was a line in that interview where he said "Oh, what do I have right-wing views about? Nothing," right? And then I don't know that he himself would say that now, right? I think that I certainly feel he's. I mean, you mentioned the most egregious example, which is saying that that time he said that Tucker Carlson was a socialist, but I think in general, his years of working with Tucker Carlson, he's gotten way too defensive of Tucker Carlson, who I really think is one of the most genuinely loathsome people in media. And I actually wondered about that because because Glenn interviewed me on his show about my book Canceling Comedians, and like in there's a line where I refer to Tucker Carlson as a toxic propagandist, and I kept wondering if he was going to like bring that up, right? But it's like, yeah, I think I get a general sense. It's like, look, maybe this is unfair. I don't, I used to read Glenn religiously. I don't anymore, right? So it's like I could be missing a lot of what he's saying, right? I'll have conversations with him on this podcast or other podcasts like once every year or so, right? So it's like I could be missing a lot. But my possibly unfair impression is that when he kind of weighs in on whatever political stuff people are fighting about at any given moment, like outside of a few issues, like he was, I mean, certainly by like let's put it this way, by like mid 2023, my impression had started to become that every time he weighed in on like the news cycle, whatever was going on that minute, and that like Democrats and Republicans were fighting about that minute, if he weighed in at all, it was always kind of on the pro-Republican or at least anti-Democrat side of it, right? That like he would, like the stuff he chose to intervene on, right? He always seemed to be like siding with, Tucker, or siding with Trump against Democrats. And that was my impression in like mid 2023. And I remember feeling really frustrated about it back then. And then I guess to be totally fair about this, then after October 7th happened, like there was a period where he was fighting with conservatives all the time because he's always been very good on Palestine, and he's still very good on Palestine. Yeah. Right? Yeah. That's never changed. Right. So like that's, I kind of started to have like much warmer feelings about Glenn Greenwald. I also like that fall that then like I had in years probably, right? Like that's why I had him on my show in December 2023. Because, I kind of asked him at the beginning of the segment, right? I was like, okay, well, now that you've seen like the way that like the only people opposing this are like, the sort of squad wing of the Democrats, right? And all the Republicans are like super duper pro-war, and Trump super duper pro-war. All the Republicans are super duper anti-free speech for like Palestine protesters. Trump certainly is. Does this kind of change your view? And his basic stance in that segment was like, no, yes, they're very bad on this. I think there are like particular reasons they're very bad on this. I still think overall, the Democrats are more interventionist on foreign policy or whatever. And, that's so like that was like kind of the argument we had in that segment. Right. So it's like
surprisingly short memory, but I would also say that like, I think a lot of this, I think a lot of the reasons this sounds kind of new to me is that I think a lot of this sounds like it just comes from his social media presence.
That's probably true. I would imagine if you're reading Substack or watching System Update.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I encounter that side of him as much, which is really, the onus is on me there, but
I mean, I don't know. Anybody who spends less time on Twitter is always making a better choice than anybody who spends more time on Twitter. So
sure. But like, yeah, like you said, like I think the only times I've like watched an interview he's done recently, it was like, he had Norman Finkelstein on, he had like Chris Hedges on or something. And it's just like, I don't see a huge difference when, I encounter him very less often now, I guess. And so I don't follow his work as closely. So I just don't see the differences as much, I think, because I'm not on social media a lot. But
I should also say a lot of the stuff that I haven't liked, I don't know that that's even so much that like him changing positions on that stuff as that like it's just that like there are a lot of issues that he might not have ever particularly commented on before, right? Like that like it's not, because like the sort of best and worst thing about Glenn Greenwald has always been that he's like historically been very hyper focused on like a few issues, And when he was most hyper focused on them, it was like, well, this is all stuff I think he's pretty much right about, right? Whereas now it could be that at least on social media, maybe to some extent in System Update and other places, he's like commenting on a broader range of issues and like, I'm going to notice more disagreements, right?
Yeah.
But like, I do generally think that he's bought into this narrative that there's been this like big realignment in American politics where like, the neocons are Democrats now, and the Republicans are, the ones who are like at least more sympathetic to like anti-war, pro, civil liberties views. And I think that like the first part of that's kind of true, although it's only kind of true because like there were a lot of dyed-in-the-wool neocons in the Trump administration, right? That John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and whatever, but yeah, I mean, I think that I think the second's just wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like I actually think overall the Republicans are worse on that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So like if nothing else, we have a big disagreement about that, and then if nothing else, I think there's disagreement about kind of emphasis. And then probably also on some issues, right? Like, I mean, I think that, like, I mean, I can remember in like probably the first time I really noticed, like, because like, again, usually like many years, I read his work so consistently, right? Like it, for many years. And it's like, usually I would like agree with like 90% of it, right? And like the first time I really noticed him being like off on something, like the first time I really noticed like an issue where I thought I was like, okay, wait a second, that's just wrong, right? Like is like in 2021 when he was like saying it was like authoritarian that the Democrats wanted to get rid of the Senate filibuster. I was like, okay, that's like he's really gone wrong on this, right? And it's maybe a sort of small issue, the sort of not, but I mean, again, I think there are other things since then that I've had lots of disagreements with, but like none of this is to say, I mean, I really do think the issues that are most important to him, he's been very consistent and very good on, right?
Yeah.
Civil liberties, Palestine, drones, war,
And I did want to say, just like going back to the like last segment of the debate we watched, like, so I mean, the first thing, because like I didn't mean to like get on a thing about Glenn Greenwald. I really like his work, but like the segment of the debate we just watched, the last segment that we just watched, the debate opens with this question of like, and I think actually Jeremy Scahill is the one to ask the question of like, don't you think it's weird that Trump is lying about all these things? And Glenn's answer is like, no, I don't think it's weird that Trump and his closest advisors are liars. But like I think
sociopathic liars,
right.
I think he said.
Yeah, and the part of that like I think is really interesting is that like, and again, like I'll pose it as a question, like, do you think Trump would act any differently with this investigation being done? Like, let's be really specific. Like, I think we could probably agree that if nothing else, Trump was guilty of like obstruction of justice,
sure,
right? Into the Mueller investigation. Like, I think, what do you think he would have obstructed justice just as much if he was innocent?
Yeah, I mean, I think Glenn's largely right about this. I think that there could be like, I remember thinking that at the time, right? That it's like, look, and I'd also want to differentiate. You say if he's innocent, it's like, well, innocent of what, right? Like, in other words, like
everything,
yeah,
except obstruction of justice.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, right? So I think Glenn's point is a decent one in the debate about like it could be like just sort of like avoiding political embarrassment. Could be like a good enough reason to do that. But like I also thought at the time, it's like, I was like, okay, I remember actually something I think I said in social media posts at the time. Again, this is largely before I was doing, more public political stuff. like, yeah, people kept, like, various people at, like, different levels, the Trump machine kept getting busted over the course of this investigation, but they were never busted for the core Russiagate stuff. They were always busted for other crimes, right? So it's like, okay, so I remember saying at the time, it could be that Mueller is doing what prosecutors sometimes do when they build cases, which is like nailing like associates on, like, you know, lower level unrelated crimes, so you can then flip them and use them to, like, testify against the big guy or whatever. So it could be he's building up to the big, you know, perp walking Trump across the White House lawn over the Russia stuff. But it could just be that Trump has surrounded himself with petty criminals. So it's like he can't find anything on the core Russia stuff, but he does keep finding evidence of other crimes. So it's like, all right, well, while I'm here, I might as well, you know, bust them for this stuff, which is, like, kind of what it seemed like to me at the time, right? That's like, you know, it's like, yeah, I mean, everybody, like, a lot of the people, like, I always thought, like, if you ever watched, like, what season that was, The Sopranos, where Christopher was a SEC compliance officer, right? You know, he was doing the stock trading, and there were those like two guys who were, I want to say the third season maybe. Anyway, but there were like in that season there were like two guys who worked with Christopher as like thugs to, like, at the brokerage, who were like always trying to, like, suck up to him and, like, get him to, like, introduce them to Tony and stuff like that. Yeah, remember those guys, right? And I always remember, okay, yeah, seasons 3 to 4 apparently from the chat. I always remember thinking, it's like, yeah, basically the first Trump administration was full of guys who were, like, exactly like those two, right? Like these kind of, like, hustler petty criminals who, like, were kind of desperate to make themselves seem more important than they were. And it's like, yeah, sure, I'm sure those guys committed lots of crimes, right? Like, that's like,
but my point is not whether they committed any crimes. It's whether they committed some crimes or different crimes than they were going after Trump for, or whether they didn't do anything. Trump responds the same way, I think, in all those scenarios.
Yeah, I mean,
again,
I think, well, my point is just that, like, Trump would still have lots to hide, even if he wasn't hiding this specifically.
Right, yeah.
And that could be both either what Glenn was kind of suggesting, stuff that's, like, not necessarily criminality, but would just be embarrassing, or it could be like what I was suggesting, which is, like, you know, other crimes that just have nothing to do with the investigation. That, like, because, yeah, he's a weird criminal. I mean, like, he was a weird criminal long before he became president. I think he's on tape being like, you know, like, I think there is actual, like, old footage of him, you know, from, like, the you know, from, like, the Apprentice years or whatever, being like, oh yeah, no, I've had dealings with the mafia, sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I also thought it was interesting when James Risen was like, I think you, Glenn Greenwald, are just approaching this as, like, a political story, political consequences. And, like, I just think it's a good news story. And, like, I thought that was interesting for a couple reasons, but I think the most important one is that Glenn Greenwald is pretty relentless in his critique about approaching this as a legal question, which he doesn't. I was surprised he didn't say that. Like, it's neither a political thing or a news thing to me. In this instance, like, you're making a very specific legal accusation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that. Yeah, I mean, I think Glenn's response to that was reasonable, right? It's like, he's like, look, I mean, he was like, sure, I may be more interested in the politics of this than you are, but, like, also, I think it is an important journalistic thing to, like, really insist on, like, because it's like, I mean, it does go beyond the legal point, I think, because it's not just like, okay, there isn't enough evidence to like prosecute, right? Like, I think the broader point, which is, I would argue at least, is a different one, is, well, there just isn't enough evidence to, like, justify believing this, right? Like, and you know, again, yet is always the word that, you know, should go at the end of that sentence, right? That's like, because it doesn't, you know, I mean, he even said at one point, he's like, look, I'm not saying I would be surprised at all if it were true, right? I'm just saying, like, you know, we shouldn't accept accusations made by intelligence officials that aren't backed up by public evidence, and that seems like a really good principle. And so it's like the same thing, by the way, right now, right, with like the Trump people have been claiming that like Iran was trying to assassinate him. It's like, yeah, let's see the evidence for that, buddy, right? Before we start believing it.
And I would also add that just because I think it was such a lazy response by Ryzen that I'd like to highlight it, like just the fact that something makes for a good news story by itself is not reason to report it.
Yeah. It'd be a good story if it were true, but like, let's find out if it's true. Yeah, I agree with that. All right, guys. I gotta go. I have to figure out whether I'm. I do theoretically have a ticket for a movie that's starting in 15 minutes. But I don't know if I'm gonna make. I don't know if I'm even doing that. I need to figure out if I'm driving back to Mexico to get the backup computer, or whether I can get a deal at Best Buy for some $100 Chromebook or something that'd be slightly less than the gas and tolls to go to Mexico and back, and or what I'm doing tonight, so I can get work done over the weekend. But whatever I'm doing, I got to do it. But thank you for suggesting this. This was fun. This was really strange and interesting to revisit, especially given the timing, right? That I was out at the bar with my younger brother last night, and we were joking about how we're in year 9 of liberals saying the walls are closing in on Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
they all agree on hating Russia. It's bipartisan. If it's bipartisan, that's how you know it's shitty.
Yeah, so maybe the walls aren't going to close in. Maybe you're going to actually have to defeat Trumpism politically. In any case, I was going to go see Conclave. I don't necessarily have high expectations. I just thought it looked like it could be fun. I saw Heretic a couple nights ago. I actually really enjoyed that one, so I would recommend that. I'm not totally sure how I feel about the ending as a payoff, but it was a very well constructed movie. But in any case, on that note, I will be back on Monday interviewing Matt McManus about his new book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. So I will see people then. Left is best.
Oh, word.